Welcome everyone. So today I wanted to go through something that is super important for everything that you do in the education world. Now, whether you're teaching adults, teaching phonics, teaching special needs, teaching high school, teaching primary school, it doesn't matter where you are teaching, setting goals and working within goals and around goals, helping kids to achieve their goals are really important. And there's a few reasons for that, and these are the reasons that I'll outline in a minute, but you'll hear me talk about these in lots of different webinars, and if you ever do a course with us, it's something that we drill into our students over and over again. Now, goals are important for three main reasons actually. Firstly, accountability. You as an educational professional need to be accountable not only to yourself, but to your employer, to the parents of your children, to the parents of your students, if they're children, or to whoever's paying for the course that they're enrolled in. So if you're teaching adults, it might be the government's paying for the course, it might be an employer or a corporate that's paying for the course. And it also means that you're accountable in that what you say you're going to do as a professional, that you're actually going to do that. So if you say, I'm going to have a series of lessons over a period of 6 months to teach kids phonics, and they're going to get to this particular standard, they're here, and we want to improve them to here, then you're going to achieve that goal. And there are a few different ways that you can go about planning and setting goals. Watch my planning lectures and some of the other strategies that we go through in the various different webinars. And you will have noticed that I use this SMART goal setting method quite regularly. SMART is a very simple and very easy to remember strategy when it comes to setting and working with goals. Now, before we get on to that, there were, as we were saying, 3 different reasons. So the first one is accountability. The second one is so that you can help kids to achieve their goals, and by doing so, you're improving their motivation and you're improving their self-esteem. Now, if you want kids to come back into class the next day, to not be an issue from a behavioural point of view, then the number one way you can do that is that you can go about doing that is to improve their self-esteem. And the number one way that you can improve self-esteem is by helping kids to achieve not only milestones, but also micro goals. And we'll get on to that later on. Now, there is, of course, a third reason, which is also very important, and that's related to the first two, but also making sure that you set out what you set out to achieve or what you're required to teach, that you teach it in a logical flow and that you allow enough structural time for each of those different activities. So if you've got 10 weeks to teach something, then you make sure that in week 1, you teach a certain amount. In week 2, you teach a certain amount, and in week 3, and so on and so forth. So is that structural, skeletal planning part of it, the logistical reasons for why setting goals are really important. Now, the other thing I'll point out is that educational professionals, by nature of what they do, set goals all the time. What they quite often fail to do is to record those goals and to think about them in a strategic fashion. So if you're walking into any classroom, you will have a goal in mind. You always will have a goal or a series of goals in mind. The important thing is to articulate those and be able to tell the students in those class what those goals are, because then you can work backwards and try and figure out how we can achieve them. And that's why outlining, just as I've done here, I always do this at the start of every lesson, no matter who I'm teaching, whether it's kids or adults. I always write down what the goals are at the start on the whiteboard and go through and explain them. And at the end or during, you're relating back to it as well. So quite often students, especially those that don't have a high amount of self-esteem, including adults, will never have experienced meeting goals before, and they may score 65% in a test, but still be really disappointed in what they've got wrong. But if you've got a goal that clearly shows that so long as you score 55% or more, then they've achieved their goal, then you can relate them back to that and say, well, you achieved your goal. That was the most important thing. Of those things that we got wrong, there's other 35% or whatever it is, we can go back and look at that in future lessons, but that's a separate goal. Our number one goal was to achieve a certain percentage or be able to do a certain percentage of these questions. That means you've gotten the bare bones basics correct so far, and we can move on to now looking at the more advanced stuff and starting to get that down pat. So setting goals is really important for a number of different reasons. Teachers, teacher aides, educational professionals do it anyway. The step that is quite often missing is making sure that those are clearly articulated to your students and that you're constantly referring back to them. Okay, so now let's start with SMART goals. The reason I like to use SMART goals is because it's an easy acronym to remember. It's very simple, and while there are different iterations of this, this is the one that I think is the easiest and the best one, although you can use any different version that you like. Just Google it and you'll find a few different ways, a few different words that you can use there. But I like this one. So the first two, for me, I think the first two are the most important, and that's making sure that, SMART is not the very first one. Okay, so the very first one is specific. So by being specific, it means that your goals aren't, I like to use the word aloof. They're not abstract. They're not wishy-washy. They are very, very, and as specific as you can possibly get. In one of the other videos I did recently, we were talking about having 3 separate goals. So it'd have G1, G2, G3. And the example, this was for a single lesson, but you would also set, say, 3 main goals for a longer program, even if up to a year or so, you'd have specific goals. Now, those goals may be, for example, use Venn diagram example 1 to 4. So you may want student, use is probably not the right word, but you may have a series of examples that you've recorded separately, and you want students to be able to use and explain number 1 to 4. So that can be your first goal. So that's very specific. You might have another goal, and I'm just going to skip to a completely different topic here, is that they can read, or completely different subject, read level 2 at, let's say, 80% accuracy. Okay, so when we're teaching kids to read, or even adults, usually there's whatever program that we use, there's usually some type of level system, right? Level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. Kids can go and get, say, a level 2 book. And as they read a paragraph to you or a few sentences, you're basically ticking words to say correct, 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 incorrect, or they stumble or say or whatever, then that might be a dot. You want them to be able to do that 80%, and I won't bother doing a third one because I think you sort of get the point. So those are very specific examples of goals that you want students to achieve. Now that first one, the Venn diagram one, that one might be, say, 1 hour. So that might take 1 hour, whereas this second one here, level 2, depending on where they started, let's say they've already achieved that in level 1, level 2 may take 3 months. For some students, it may take a year. For some students, it may take 5 weeks. I mean, it really depends, and it depends on the program as well. All these different reading programs have fancy names and things. They're all pretty much exactly the same, or very similar anyway. You're practicing and learning those words that come up quite regularly. So what we call deliberate practice, which is a strategy. I've got another video about that. And high utility words, so words that come up all the time, particularly those top 500 or so words that I think we use, 98% of the words we use are those top 500 or so words. Okay, so moving away from that example, So they're very, very specific. Now, the other thing you'll notice about those goals is that they're measurable as well. Now, what we mean by measurable is that you can test it or you can prove it. So you can run a test or an assessment of some description, and that doesn't have to necessarily be a formal assessment. You don't need kids or students to sit down and do literally a piece of paper that has test written across the top and then get them to do 15 questions or whatever. It can be measurable using more informal testing methods, like if you're just sitting and having a chat to them, so something of an informal interview. Or even if you're just getting some responses for students as you're walking around the class, or doing some worked examples on the board, or a bit of a review at the end of the lesson. So that would be a perfectly valid, measurable outcome as well. So this one here, read at level 2, that one would definitely need to be some type of a formal test, because you are sitting there with the student, ticking or putting dots above words that they're getting wrong or right, and then tallying them up. So that's where that one would be a bit more formal. Whereas the Venn diagram one, if you're basing a lesson on example 1 to 4 from a textbook or whatever, then you'll get a pretty good feel for if students know how to do that just from being in the lesson and running the lesson. You can do examples at the very end and get students to come up, or get them to show you as they leave, or whatever you end up doing. But then again, you may actually do it as a formal thing. So you might leave those examples to the very end and write them on the board and do some silent 6 minutes to quickly do this diagram, to do these Venn diagrams, or to answer these questions or whatever. But either way, the point is, regardless of how you go about doing it, yes, it's specific, and yes, it is actually measurable. So you can prove it, almost think of it like proving it in a court of law. So you can measure it and prove it to someone else. Now, attainable is kind of, once you've done the first two, the rest of them kind of fall into place anyway. Attainable basically just means that it's possible for students to achieve that particular goal. Now, that may seem natural. Sorry, that may seem natural if for the second one, because that is something that's probably a goal that's been set for an individual student. But for the first one, that's something that's more like a group goal or a class goal. Now, if the class goal, if you do have a class goal and you've got a large class, there may be a certain percentage of students where that particular goal is unattainable. So it's just worth thinking about whether that goal suits every student, or if you want to have slightly different goals for different students, or how you want to go about sort of doing that. But if you're setting goals that are unattainable, or that students are unlikely to be able to meet, then you're probably going to have problems there, and students are going to exhibit a bunch of task avoidance behaviours so that they can prevent themselves from failing in front of their peers, and that could be in the form of swearing at a teacher, or any of those type of extreme behaviours that you see quite often, so that they get kicked out of class. So anyway, making sure that the goal is attainable is an important thing to think about. And so some students might only have the goal to do the first one because it's relatively easy. Other students, you might want them to actually do 1 to 6 or something like that. Relevant, that one's pretty logical. Obviously, it's relevant to the topic at hand, so you wouldn't set a goal that is not to do with Venn diagrams, or something that's slightly different. So, for example, if you're in a maths program and you're setting goals about group work and students communicating with each other and all these types of things as your main goals, they would be what we would call secondary goals. Actually, that's a good one to write up. So secondary goals. Now, if you did want your main goals to have something to do with communication, or rapport building, or teamwork, or whatever, and it was in a math lessons, that's fine. But remember that you're accountable to that. You need to be able to measure it, and you need to be specific, and you also need to be transparent. So you need to be able to tell, say, parents or your managers that here are the 3 goals that I'm concentrating on. 1 is Venn diagrams, 2 is teamwork. Now, if teamwork is a main goal, then and you've communicated that, then you should probably devote some time to it as well. Otherwise, it becomes something of just a secondary cross-curricular type goal. Now, that, or generics or transferable skills as they're often called as well, that doesn't mean it's any less important, but it means that these are the ones that follow the SMART process and the SMART model, and the ones that students are being assessed on, they're being reported on, and the secondary goals, while you can concentrate on them to some extent, are only a smaller portion of the lesson. And these, while the Venn diagram thing, you might move on from lesson to lesson or after a few lessons to something different, quite often those secondary goals sort of stick with you throughout the program, so they transcend more than one subsection of that particular curriculum. But anyway, we're getting off topic a little bit. And time, so obviously making sure that, well, can they achieve 80% accuracy within a reasonable period of time? Because even as adults, if you set the goal too high and students can't achieve that goal within 5 years or something, it really becomes difficult for people to maintain that motivation. So you want to have goals that can be achieved within a reasonable period of time. And that obviously depends on the student and the program and things like that. Sometimes that'll mean smaller micro goals and milestones, which we'll get to in a sec. But other times that means what we want to do today, what we want to do tomorrow, what we want to do by the end of the week, and so on and so forth. So thinking about the time and having a specific endpoint, we want to achieve this goal by this particular point. So a SMART goal for these might be use Venn diagrams, such as example 1 to 4. So we might say actually use basic Venn diagrams, such as example 1 to 4, without assistance by the end of the term. So we've added in some time there as well. So we've just put a date is what we want to add in. So read level 2 at 80% accuracy by term 3 end. So by the end of term 3. And the other thing that might be a good idea is to add in sort of a descriptor, I guess, consistently. So consistently read level 2 at 80% accuracy by the end of term 3. Now that consistency as well, you might want to define that a little bit depending on how specific you want to get. So you could probably say that, this may sound a bit weird, but 80% of the time you want them to read at 80% accuracy, or 60% or 100% of the time. Sometimes 100% of the time. There's a strategy called mastery learning, a teaching strategy called mastery learning. And with mastery learning, it means that students have to achieve a certain level of proficiency before they're allowed to go to the next step. Now that could be, usually it's about 90% or so, but that could be 80%. Whereas in a lot of the classes and topics that we teach these days, particularly in just your normal education system, not specific programs, then students really only need to get a 50-odd%. And even if they get 30%, they still just get pushed through and they just keep going along with the rest of their peers. So mastery learning, when you're planning out your programs and lessons or whatever you're doing, it's really important to consider whether it's a mastery learning program. Actually, there's another one just out of interest called overlearning. I think that's got a hyphen. Overlearning. Now, overlearning is basically where, let's say this is a standard that you want to get at. You teach students to this level, so they go, say, 130% or whatever. And what happens with overlearning is then in the future when they have to perform, say in an exam, an external exam or whatever, the chances of them getting 100% is just quite easy because they've learned not only what they need to know, but gone well beyond that. So they're not aiming to pass, they're not aiming to get 80 or 90%, they're aiming to get 130%. So it's just another way of conceptualizing the learning process. Okay, so a couple of strategies there. I like to write those down. Now, so that is SMART goals, very important for any learning sequence, program, course, lesson, or even a 5-minute activity. Think about the specific and measurable side of it if you are helping kids out or students out with a 5 or 10 minute activity. If you sit down next to a student to help a person who is having problems with something specific, say a Venn diagram, then remember what is the specific goal of the next 5 minutes? What is this child trying to achieve? And how will we measure that this little micro lesson or mini lesson has been successful? So that might be that they can actually achieve that example 1 or example 2 or whatever, but it might be that they can do all of them, or it might be just a specific part of those activities. Okay, so now I just wanted to quickly talk about these concepts over here. I wrote them up there just to remind me because they are relatively important. Now, first you have milestones. So generally in any lesson plan, any course, you will have, say, your overarching sort of goals. Now that is, let's call that your annual or term. So they're more like long-term goals. So you'll have, for the year, you may have certain goals for students. Let's use reading example. You'll have certain reading goals. This could be for one student or as a general class. You'll have goals for, by the end of this year, this is what I want to achieve, right? And you can break that down into smaller goals as well. Now, when you do that, you then have, let's say there are 3 of them. Now, let's say there are 4 of them because there's usually 4 terms. You will have more goals as well. Now, I like to call those milestones because if your end goal at the end of the term is to be able to read at, say, level 4 with 80% accuracy, then you're going to have progress goals or milestones. So let's just call those milestones. And again, the whole purpose behind goals is to make sure that where you start here, that you finish there, and that you can see that there's a trending sequence, a trending push in the right direction, and your sequence of learning and as well as your assessments is pushing in that right direction so that there's progress, I guess you could say. But also that students can see that there's a point to what they're doing each week. If they're doing 3 or 4 lessons per week of reading, and it's hard work, and they're being assessed all the time, and they're also doing a heap of reading at home each evening, it's good for them to be able to see how they're progressing. And that can mean, for example, that you're just letting them know you've hit another milestone, you've hit another milestone, you've hit another milestone. Public acknowledgement of achieving goals and milestones by having a board where they can put stickers up every time they reach another level, or if maybe they wanted to read 20 books at level 2 before they be assessed, and if they can put little stickers up on a board that shows publicly that they're moving through and progressing, then that can help with their motivation and their self-esteem as well. So, because if you don't let them know whether they're achieving anything, you can't make the assumption that they'll know that they're getting better, because that improvement is so gradual over a period of time that quite often people, including adults, don't realise that they're getting any better, even though they're out of sight improved on where they actually started. So, okay, now, so that's what we call milestones. Now, within each of those milestones, so that's a term, you're going to have what I usually call micro goals. So let's say there's 4 of those for each of them. So about 2 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks of each. So that we'll call them, I guess, micro goals. I also like to use the word micro goals for what students can achieve each lesson. So if you take this one here, and let's say there's 5 lessons for this particular thing. Just making this up. No, let's go 8. Okay, so there's 8 lessons. Each one of those can have their own little micro goal as well. So that way, again, students know it's like, this is what we set out to achieve for today's lesson. Did we achieve it? Yes or no? Why did we not achieve it if we didn't achieve it? Why did we achieve it? Maybe that goal needs to be spread out over multiple lessons. Okay, so these are what we call micro goals. Now, we've spoken a lot about motivation and self-esteem and why goals are really important there. But one thing we haven't spoken much about is where we started, and we were talking about accountability and why accountability is really important. Given that you've planned out and you know what this goal here is, this micro goal, you should be able to reconciliate or trace, I guess you could call it, how that goal relates to that overall goal. There. So how that micro goal is relevant to that overarching large picture sort of goal, and how that goal helps students to achieve that, how that goal there helps them to achieve that, and so forth. So all these ones are directly, and even these ones here, all these ones just go straight down, so they're pretty easy. And you may even plan it out like that. I'm not saying you have to, but in your own mind you should be thinking, how does this micro goal, today's lesson that I'm doing right now, how does that help this particular student or this group of students achieve that annual or long-term goal, or just the term or semester goal? And if it doesn't help them achieve that, then it doesn't belong here. And you know why it doesn't belong here? Because then it's not relevant. Cool. Now, the other thing we've also done is time-wise, we have figured out that these micro goals lead to the achievement of these milestones, or what I like to call progress goals. Okay, so now what we've basically done then is shown that from a time perspective, the time perspective here, that everything has worked in well as far as these small micro goals fitting in time-wise with our progress goals or our milestones, which all fit in with our goals across the top. So you can state emphatically that when students start here, they're going to reach a certain point, say chronologically at this end, and achieve that particular goal. Now, not only are that SMART goal then becomes time correct as far as setting a SMART goal, it's relevant, it's attainable, it's measurable, and it's specific. And again, as we were saying before, these little micro goals here can all be directly traced back, as well as your progress goals can be traced up as well. Now, moving on to the next aspect that we do need to talk about is your secondary goals, or your, I guess if you call these your primary goals, you might have a few secondary goals, transferable goals, employability goals, transferable goals, generic skills, those types of things. They go by various different names depending on the institution that you're working in. Cross-curricular goals is another one, or cross-curricular priorities is the new sort of terminology. Now, they kind of float on top of everything else. So I've just drawn these in here. You may do a little bit there, a little bit there, a little bit there, and a little bit there. So let's say it's teamwork, and I think the example I use quite regularly is working with students with autism. If teamwork was a social skill that you wanted to concentrate on, then you would make sure that that was embedded throughout, and as you're working through those lessons or planning out those lessons, you would talk about the type of teamwork skills and communication skills that were important. For example, turn taking. I talk, then you talk, then I talk, then you talk, and we reflect backwards and forth like that. So that could be one example of a secondary goal. Another one that I add in all the time, you're not going to be able to read that because I've run out of space, is metacognitive skills. Now, metacognitive skills or metacognitive skills training is something that very few teachers, very few trainers, very few teacher aides ever teach their students, and I think that's a big shame because it's super important, it's super effective, and for students to become independent, highly motivated learners, they need to have well-developed metacognitive skills. Metacognitive skills mean you're going beyond just teaching the content. So you're not just teaching reading or teaching Venn diagrams or whatever. You're actually teaching kids how to learn. So one example of a metacognitive skills is how to scaffold, how to chunk things down, how to attack problems, how to figure out what you know, what you don't know, of what you don't know, how do you divide that up into smaller sections, how can you plan an attack to learn something. And other things like recognizing that when you are learning any new body of language, body of knowledge or skills, that it is frustrating and you will go through periods of frustration. So anyway, they're called metacognitive skills, super important. It's a big area that I think if you're not familiar with and you're working in the education sector, I highly recommend that you spend quite a bit of time learning about metacognitive skills, because that's something that you will really see benefits from if you start regularly embedding that into your day-to-day practice. So those secondary skills float above the top, and as with all of these types of things, just make sure that you're transparent. If there's anything in there that you're unsure about or that you don't want others to know, say parents of your children or whatever, if there's or that you feel uncomfortable that you're adding in, whether it's a bit of an activist thing or political thing or whatever, then maybe it's best not to put that in and to avoid that topic altogether. So, because sometimes we do see things in that secondary space that's a little bit ideological. So just make sure you're completely transparent when you are working with students or communicating information to whoever's paying for that course or whoever's responsible for that student, that you're very transparent about what those secondary goals are. And just out of interest, if you want to look some interesting reading, look up a term called the hidden curriculum on Google, and you'll find some interesting things there. So those secondary goals, by the way, should also fit into that category, or fit this model. So they should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and very time conscious. Okay, so that is goal setting or setting goals as far as working in the education sector is concerned.